Hello students, this is the last set of videos for Math 135, so we've almost made it. So what we're going to talk about today are logical fallacies. So this is, everything we've been talking about so far has kind of been like how do you use logic correctly. This is how you use it incorrectly. And a lot of people do this, and so it's something you want to watch out for so that you can see when people are doing it and using it incorrectly and kind of understand that they're really trying to pull something over on you. Okay? So we're going to start off first by talking about what a fallacy is, and then about two fallacies about ways of using logic incorrectly. And then we'll talk about fallacies of language, which are where you use, you don't use logic at all. You try and convince somebody with other means that are not logically valid. Okay? So what a fallacy is it's a bad logical argument. So it's a logical argument that does not that doesn't make sense, that isn't supported by kind of the logical reasoning that we've talked about so far. Okay? And so the first type, like I said, is fallacies where we use logic incorrectly. So if you want to make a logical argument, what you have to do is combine statements that are true, and then if those statements are true, it makes a third statement or a fourth statement or whatever automatically true. It has to be true if the first two are true. And so let me give you an example of this, kind of using what we've worked with before. So I'm going to set up an argument where we say, if I study for the exam, I will do well. I studied for the exam. Therefore, I will do well. Okay? So this is a good logical argument. So this is actually logically valid. Okay? So what we're saying in this particular situation, our first argument, our first statement here is A implies B. If I study for the exam, which is our A, then B will happen. Okay? And if you remember this statement, A implies B, this is true if either A and B are both true, or if A is false and B is either true or false. Okay? The one time when it's not true is if A is true and B is false. Okay? And that's kind of the key to this argument, because what we're going to say next is A, right? So we say A implies B is true. A is true. And so if you think about it, based on the truth table for A implies B for this statement, if A is true, B has to be true. Okay? Because remember, when we set this up, we said A, B, A implies B. Right? Our truth table looked like this. So if A was true and B was false, A implies B also has to be false. And so since A implies B is true, we have to be in one of these three situations. Since A is true, we have to be in this situation. Okay? And so then B has to be true, must be true. Okay? And so that's kind of how a good logical argument works. You take two things that are true, and then you say, okay, if these two things are true, then the third thing has to be true. Okay? And it's pretty straightforward, right? If I study for the exam, I will do well. I studied for the exam, therefore I will do well. However, if you're not careful with the logic, you can get yourself into trouble with this. Okay? So I'm going to keep the same statement up, and I'm going to write down something different that doesn't work. So if I study for the exam, I will do well. I did well, therefore I studied for the exam. Okay? Very similar to what I just had up, but different, right? I've switched I did well and I studied for the exam, and that makes all the difference. Okay? So what we've got here is A implies B is true. B is true. And what we're saying then is that therefore A must be true. But if you look again at your truth table, and I should have just left this up, what I get. Okay? If A implies B is true, so we're in one of these three situations, and B is true, if A implies B is true and B is true, then we're in one of these two situations. We're either here, okay, or we're here. A implies B is true, B is true. So we're in one of these two situations. But what our truth table tells us is that A could be either true or false. Okay? And so this argument doesn't hold up. Okay? This is called the fallacy of the converse. Let me write that up here. So this is the fallacy of the converse. Okay? And if you think about it, just kind of reasoning about it, you can imagine if I study for the exam, I will do well. Even if that's true and you did well, doesn't mean that you necessarily studied for the exam, right? Maybe the exam was really easy. Maybe, and of course you didn't do this because you're a good student, maybe you cheated, right? Or maybe, I don't know. There could be other explanations why you did well. It doesn't necessarily mean that you studied for the exam. All that we're saying here is that if you study, you'll do well. Okay? So the fallacy of the converse is always set up in this way, right? So it will always say something like, if A implies B and B, then A. And this is wrong. Okay, this is a bad argument. People use these kinds of bad arguments all the time, though, right? So if you think back to the example we had in the previous videos, if you bought it somewhere else, you paid too much. What the people who are saying that want you to assume is that if you paid too much, then you bought it somewhere else, right? But that's exactly this fallacy. If you bought it somewhere else, then you paid too much, and you paid too much, so you bought it somewhere else, right? But that statement could be true, and you could have paid too much buying it from them, right? So if you paid too much, you might have bought it somewhere else, you might have bought it from us. And they don't want you to think about that, right? That they might have overcharged you. So that's another example of the fallacy of the converse. Okay? The other one that we're going to be interested in, as far as kind of bad logic, is what's called the fallacy of the inverse. Okay? And this is pretty similar. If A implies B and not A, then not B. Okay? And so, to go back to our previous example with studying and doing well on the exam, this would be like saying, if I study, I will do well. I didn't study, therefore I won't do well. Okay? And this is also not logically valid. This is, I think, even more, this is the one people make the most often, I think. It's very seductive. It says, oh, if I study, I will do well. I didn't study, therefore I won't do well. It seems really convincing, right? Unlike the fallacy of the converse, which I think is a little bit easier to see, but it's actually the exact same idea, right? So if I study, I will do well. So we're assuming that's true. I didn't study, we're assuming that's true. But that doesn't show us that we won't do well, right? So if you think about the same examples that I talked about before, what if the exam is super easy, right? You come into the exam and the professor has been like, okay, if you write your name, you get 100 points, right? If I study, I will do well still would be a true statement, right? If you'd studied, you would have done well. You didn't study, that's still a true statement because you didn't study, but you don't necessarily know that you won't do well, right? And it comes off of the same idea that the first part can be false, and then the second part can be either true or false, and this statement is still true, right? So here we're in the situation where A is false, but that doesn't tell us that B is either true or false. Okay? So those are two ways of using logic incorrectly. So if you write down a logical statement, if you've got an argument like this, you can always think about it as being, you've got A implies B, right? If A, then B, that works, right? Because A implies B. If A is true, then B is true, right? So A equals true, therefore B equals true. That one works. Or you can have the fallacy of the converse, which says A implies B, B is true, therefore A is true. That doesn't work, right? That's a fallacy. Or you can have the fallacy of the inverse, which says A implies B, not A is true, or A is false, therefore not B is true. B is false. And that's also a fallacy. That one doesn't work. Okay? So, good arguments versus bad arguments.